Hello, my lovelies. Welcome back to the Geek Suite. I'm your host and DM for the evening, the one and only Kidner Bean, and today we're continuing our D&D 5e series, Dungeons & Dragons in Ice and Fire. In this series, we'll be comparing our favorite Game of Thrones characters to their book counterparts using the D&D 5e sheets. And for all of our new viewers, be sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you can stay up to date on all of our latest content. And while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and give this video a thumbs up? It really helps the YouTube algorithm know that you like my videos. And of course, as we start all of our episodes with an all-encompassing spoiler warning for both the books and the show. And that includes things like the extended works, like The World of Ice and Fire, Fire and Blood, and the pre-release chapters of The Winds of Winter, as well as any bonus content you would find on DVDs or interviews for the HBO series. So, if you haven't engulfed all of the wonderful Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire content into your soul, be warned, I might ruin it for you. So, we've once again polled our patrons and Twitter followers, and the next character you've all chosen for me to examine is Jon Snow, the King in the North, the White Wolf. And we're kicking off the Jon Snow breakdown by looking at the A Song of Ice and Fire representation. So he's no king, not yet at least. And, as per usual, we're going to start with race. In the books, Jon Snow is human. Easy peasy. Now, there are some parts in the deeper lore that suggest that wargs and greenseers were at one point bred with the children of the forest, who were an elvish-type race according to Martin. He says that both the children of the forest and the others are based off of the Irish she. However, even if this is true, the Starks, who have all been confirmed to be wargs by Martin, have been mostly diluted with human blood for 9,000 years, so we're just going to go with human. For his class, we're going to classify him as a ranger. Though a ranger might make a living as a hunter, a guide, or a tracker, a ranger's true calling is to defend the outskirts of civilization from the ravages of monsters and humanoid hordes that press in from the wild. In some places, rangers gather in secretive orders or join forces with druidic circles. Many rangers, though, are independent almost to a fault, knowing that, when a dragon or a band of orcs attacks, a ranger might be the first, and possibly the last, line of defense. Okay, and if that's not literally Jon Snow at the wall and ranging beyond, then I don't know who classifies as a ranger. Now, Jon's got a bit of an Aragorn thing where he's a ranger with, noble blood that he's trying to hide from or distance himself from. And Jon's bringing in Winterfell makes him a little bit different from that of a classic ranger, who would normally gripe about coddled city folk and southern comforts and things like that. But Jon, being raised in a castle, has difficulty adjusting to life at the wall at first, and the other rangers consider him a coddled southern froofy lad, jokingly calling him Lord Snow. Which brings us to his background. Jon was raised as a highborn bastard, so he'd be given the noble background. This makes his life as a ranger difficult, but it eventually works for him and allows his story to progress in the north. His Stark blood makes him valuable as a potential hostage with the wildlings. He's granted an audience with Mance Rayder and later on Stannis. He's selected to shadow Lord Commander Mormont as his steward, and is, as such, groomed for leadership, as this would be a natural progression for a noble character. And, before his mutiny, he's elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch after Mormont's death. As far as alignment goes, Jon starts his story, like all the Starks, as lawful good. And I would argue that he more or less maintains this alignment throughout the books. The way events in his life conflict with his morality are the majority of conflict for Jon. The others and the ice zombies and the looming threat of the wildlings sort of taking a back seat to this, who am I, how am I living with these choices when I have to deal with these types of conflicts. So for Jon, having to do what is best, even if it's not something he agrees with, is a problem for him. Or it's doing things that he wants to do, but would be considered quote-unquote wrong by a lawful good code. Such as when he decides to start sleeping with Ygritte. He initially feels guilty about it because he has this vow of, I'll never create a bastard because I'm a bastard and my life is so horrible, living his child called it mantra. And, he initially feels guilty about it, but as a 14-year-old boy, he gets over it pretty quickly, almost to a comical point. Later on, he feels guilt about having to kill Corrin Halfhand, but he knows it's for the greater good. He disapproves of the Night's Watch's agreement with Craster, thinking it immoral because Craster's a horrible person, and if it were up to Jon, none of them would take shelter there. And we see that when he joins with the Wildlings and, as Lord Commander, brings them together, he tries to broker a peace to save humanity, to do what's best for everyone, and he eventually has to deal with the political fallout of that. We see that when Alice Karstark arrives at the Wall, and I think Sansa's arrival at the Wall was supposed to be a nod to that in the show, it's really hard to know what Benioff and Weiss were thinking. But I digress. His solution to her political problem of her uncle / the Castellan trying to usurp her inheritance of Carhold is to use Westerosi laws to help her secure her home and to try to broker peace with the Free Folk by marrying her to the Magnar of Thenn. And for those who only saw the show, the Thenn in the books are not cannibals and are actually highly regarded amongst the Free Folk and the Westerosi people because they're the most culturally like the people in Westeros. They're hierarchically organized. They fight in organized units. They wear armor. They have titles and an interconnected social structure. And so Jon tries to maintain order by enforcing and obeying the laws of the land in order to accomplish his goals. So, looking at the information we've got so far, Jon Snow is a human ranger who's lawful good and has a noble background. So we're going to go ahead and select the following skill proficiencies for him. As a ranger, he's going to get animal handling, as we see with his relationship with Ghost. Athletics, because he's a skilled fighter and he can do stuff like climb walls and ride horses and do all kinds of crazy stuff. And survival, because Jon is a survivor, up until he isn't. And as a noble, he's going to go ahead and get the proficiency skills for history and persuasion. Okay, so now that we've gotten the basics like race, class, and alignment and such out of the way, let's see how his character skills break down. Now, as we do for all of our characters, we're going to be doing a sort of blending of metrics for how these skill sets are determined. In D&D, character setup is you roll to see where your abilities lie and you arrange them according to what type of character you want to build. But as doing that may not line up with Jon that we see in the books, we're going to be taking evidence that we see from things Jon says and does during A Song of Ice and Fire that would tell us where these skills would pan out using the same numbering scale as a D&D character sheet. So, an average for a given ability is usually about a 10, with 14 to 16 being on the high end, and 18 and over being reserved for supernaturally powerful beings. So, in A Song of Ice and Fire, these would be people like the Others, the Dragons, and Bran. In the books, Jon is a warg, and it's suggested that he could be a very powerful one, and people like to speculate that he's going to use his warging ability to get out of being stabbed to death at the end of A Dance with Dragons. But that's yet to be determined, and I don't think the skills that we see so far are cause to give him a supernaturally powered score. Yet. Alright, so now that we reviewed how these abilities are being utilized for our D&D character sheets for Jon Snow, let's see how he does. We're going to start with the first one listed on the sheet, and that is Strength. And for Jon, we're going to put that in at a 14. We see that he's pretty strong, and he's able to do things like, climb the wall. And he hones his ult in battle. But more importantly, he can climb the wall. It is an 800-foot wall made of ice that he notes is melting in some points on hot days. So it's going to be slippery. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to walk on ice, but it is incredibly difficult. So trying to climb ice, even with the climbing gear they have, is going to be very difficult. And trying to climb 800 feet straight up is even crazier. They do mention that they have equipment, and you can see them putting on their little climbing shoes in the show, but Jon makes it a point to bitch about how shitty the Night's Watch's equipment is. And then once he's taken in by the Free Folk, he realizes how nice the Night's Watch's equipment is compared to theirs. So basically try climbing an 800-foot wall of ice with like thumbtacks held onto the bottom of your shoes with gum. he's somehow strong enough to be able to do that. So kudos to him. All right. Yeah. 14 for strength. Higher than average, but not Superman. Moving on to dexterity. Now, since Jon is a ranger, this is going to be a pretty high score for him. He's known as one of the best swordsmen in Westeros and is very agile in both the training arena and when he's in combat. So that's going to put him in at a 16 for dexterity. Let's move on to constitution. He's going to be above average here again, and this is largely due to his combat training and conditioning while living in the north. Like I said, he can climb the wall, and he can also go on long ranging trips in the cold north of the wall without getting too tired or with too much difficulty. Unlike, say, Samwell Tarly, who in his POV chapters is so worn down and broken by just these long ranging trips that he basically has to be carried so he doesn't just fall out dead. So, for Constitution, Jon Snow's gonna get a 14. Alrighty, moving on to Intelligence and Wisdom. And this is the part where Jon sort of falls into the dumb jock territory here. He isn't stupid, per se, but he's about as stupid as we'd expect a 14-year-old boy to be. So we see this with his ongoing refrain, starting with Ygritte and ending with Melisandre of, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." For example, when Ygritte is crying, as they finish the song The Last of the Giants, when they're all singing together north of the wall, Jon doesn't get why, and he doesn't understand that there's a deeper meaning of the story, among other things. And so that's when she jokingly starts her refrain of, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." He isn't really able to grasp deeper workings at play. For instance, when he's first selected as a steward instead of a ranger, he throws a fit and is ready to quit and leave before he takes his vows. And it has to be explained to him that he's being chosen as Lord Commander's steward because he's being groomed for leadership. And then once he realizes that he might one day get to be Lord Commander, he changes his mind. So we see that Jon isn't really able to understand the depth or intricacies of decision-making and politics and social constructs, which is fine. Like I said, he's 14, so that's about where we'd imagine a 14-year-old who trained for his whole life to be a fighter to be. He wasn't spending all of his time in the library. So we're going to go ahead and give him an 8 for intelligence. Because I kind of feel like even just average intelligence, you could start to pick up on things, and he just doesn't. Alright, well, that covers intelligence. Let's move on to wisdom. And, as I mentioned, Jon is wise enough to know that he really kind of doesn't know anything, and takes the wisdom given to him to heart. But the problem with that is that he tries to take all wisdom he gets from everyone he encounters to heart. And a lot of that is in direct conflict with each other, which just creates more problems for him. So I'm going to give that just an average 10. He's well-meaning, and he knows that he needs to listen to people who know more than him, but isn't really sure what wisdom to use when. All right, and now we're down to our last section, charisma. As a ranger, an outsider of society, it's not going to be as high as someone like Dany or Arya or Sansa. He has a few loyal friends and a couple of people who really hate him, but most people, until he becomes Lord Commander at least, don't really seem to care about him one way or the other. But for him being a protagonist, he probably would not ever have been made Lord Commander because he was just kind of a regular average Joe to most people. Him becoming Lord Commander doesn't really make sense, and there's definitely some tomfoolery and tricks going on in order to get him elected. And for more on that, I definitely recommend Preston Jacobs' series, The War of the Raven, which I'll go ahead and link somewhere on screen and definitely in the description section down below. And speaking of charisma, I certainly hope I don't rub you the wrong way or just fade into the background the way Jon Snow does, because I'm here to shamelessly promote my Patreon. Patrons are who make my channel possible. Our patrons get access to exclusive Patreon-only content, early access to our videos, access to the Geek Suite Discord server, and they get to participate in polls for video topics, like the one that selected the topic for today's video. And while I do sometimes post these polls on Twitter, my patrons get double the votes for being a patron. Details will be available on our Patreon page. The link is in the description section down below. Alright, so now we're going to look at things like armor class and initiative. And for other characters, we have just sort of been skimming over them, but these are going to be more important for a character like Jon Snow. Jon varies between light and medium armor classes depending on at what point in the story he's at. At the Wall, he has access to a poorly supplied armory, but as a wildling, he's only got thick padding and furs to protect him. So his armor class, which, depending on light or medium armor, is either 11 or 12 plus his dexterity modifier, is going to be between 14 and 16, which makes his speed somewhere between 20 to 30 feet depending on how much he's got on. And we're going to leave his initiative at a basic 0. Now, for the rest of this character sheet, we're really only going to stick to the boxes that are most relevant for character comparison. So, for instance, we're going to fill in other proficiencies and languages with things like horseback riding, warging, diplomacy, kind of, and High Valyrian. At least I'm putting High Valyrian because if the other Stark children learned it, he should have too. He also picks up a few words of the Old Tongue in the north, working with the Free Folk and with 1-1 the Giant, so I'm going to go ahead and give him that too, since we're really grasping at straws at this point. Now, looking at features and traits, we see the following for our Noble Ranger. So, like all the nobles in this series, he's going to have the Position of Privilege feature, which states, "Thanks to your noble birth, people are inclined to think the best of you. You are welcome in high society, and people assume you have the right to be wherever you are. The common folk make every effort to accommodate you and avoid your displeasure, and other people of high birth treat you as a member of the same social sphere. You can secure an audience with a local noble if you need to." Now, Jon's feature and privilege is a little bit different than that of a standard noble because he is bastard born, so he doesn't necessarily have things like people thinking the best of him or trying to avoid his displeasure, but they do treat him like they would another highborn person when it comes to things like securing an audience when he's dealing with diplomatic matters in the north, and being considered a highborn or high-value hostage with the Free Folk because he has Stark blood. And the rest of these are going to be features for the Ranger class. So starting at the first level, Rangers get the ability of Favored Enemy, which states, "Beginning at first level, you have significant experience studying, tracking, hunting, and even talking to a certain type of enemy." So at this point, they'll get to choose a type of favored enemy. Aberrations, beasts, celestials, constructs, dragons, elementals, fae, fiends, giants, etc., etc. Alternatively, you can select 2 races of humanoid, such as gnolls and orcs, as favored enemies. You have advantage on wisdom or survival checks to track your favored enemies, as well as on intelligence checks to recall information about them. When you gain this feature, you also learn 1 language of your choice that is spoken by your favored enemies, if they speak one at all. And we can see this a little bit when Jon interacts with the Free Folk, who at first he views as an enemy, because as the Night's Watch were enemies with the Wildlings, or the Free Folk, for the last 9,000 years. So now he's learning, after spending time with them, he has a lot more information about them, and we do see that he starts picking up the Old Tongue as he spends time with them and learns to talk to 1-1. This ability, you also get to choose an additional favorite enemy as well as an associated language, again at the 6th and 14th levels. As you gain levels, your choices should reflect the type of monsters you have encountered on your adventures. So for Jon, this may be things like picking up Scroth, the language that the others speak but was never actually shown on screen for HBO, and possibly other Free Folk languages. And maybe he'll get to use that High Valyrian if he ever encounters Dany in the books. The next ability is Natural Explorer. You are particularly familiar with 1 type of natural environment and are adept at traveling and surviving in such regions. Choose 1 type of favored terrain, Arctic, coast, desert, forest, yada yada yada. When you make an intelligence or wisdom check related to your favored terrain, your proficiency bonus is doubled if you are using a skill that you're proficient in. When traveling for an hour or more in your favored terrain, you gain the following benefits. Difficult terrain doesn't slow your group's travel. Your group can't become lost except by magical means. Even when you're engaged in another activity while traveling, such as foraging, navigating, or tracking, you remain alert to danger. If you're traveling alone, you can move stealthily at a normal pace. When you forage, you find twice as much food as you normally would. While tracking other creatures, you also learn their exact number, their sizes, and how long ago they passed through the area. And you get to choose additional favored terrain types at the 6th and 10th levels. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we see that Jon has an advantage living in the north. His constitution is a little bit higher than it would have normally been. To say Stannis and his men when they first arrived there, we see that Jon and the other Northmen are better off. And we see that during their ranging skills that he and Ghost blend into the background and do well up there. Moving on to more ranging abilities, they also have the ability to hide in plain sight. Starting at the 10th level, you can spend 1 minute creating camouflage for yourself. You must have access to fresh mud, dirt, plants, soot, and other naturally occurring materials with which to create your camouflage. Once you are camouflaged in this way, you can try to hide by pressing yourself up against a solid surface, such as a tree or a wall. This is at least as tall and as wide as you are. You gain a +10 bonus to Dexterity, or stealth checks, as long as you remain there without moving or taking actions. Once you move or take an action or a reaction, you must camouflage yourself again to gain this benefit. The next class feature for Rangers is Fighting Style. At 2nd level, you adopt a particular style of fighting as your specialty. And so for this, it can be long sword, short sword, whatever, 2-weapon fighting, whatever it is. The next special ability is going to be Land's Stride. So starting at the 8th level, moving through non-magical difficult terrain costs you no extra movement. You can also pass through non-magical plants without being slowed by them and without taking damage from them if they have thorns, spines, or a similar hazard. In addition, you have advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically created or manipulated to impede movement, such as those created by the Entangle spell. Okay, and the last class feature for this is going to be called Vanish. Starting at the 14th level, you can use the Hide action as a bonus action on your turn. Also, you can't be tracked by non-magical means, unless you choose to leave a trail. Wow, there are a lot of abilities for Rangers. I don't think I usually go into detail with the upper level ones, since I don't know that the characters at the end of A Dance with Dragons are at these upper levels, like 14th, 16th, 20th levels. But there were a lot in here, so I figured I would try to be as thorough as possible, since Jon doesn't have a lot of personality, which is what we're going to get into in just a minute. Getting through all of that bulk, we're going to talk about his personality traits, or lack thereof, and see how these breakdowns reflect his character. So, Jon Snow has this moody teenager thing going on. He's torn between what's expected of him versus how his life is going, as we mentioned earlier when discussing the torment that's caused by his alignment. In addition to that, he's got a lot of angst and drama about his status as a bastard. But other than that, he's kind of bland. As one of the main POV characters, he's supposed to be sort of nondescript so that the reader can relate and place themselves in his shoes to insert themselves in the story. And I, along with a lot of the Game of Thrones community, I'll link some great YouTubers and Twitter accounts in the description section below, agree that Jon Snow has an extreme case of this blandness so you can insert yourself, at least in the books. So for personality, he kind of doesn't have one. He's just a standard 14-year-old with a chip on his shoulder. He's got kind of a Prince Zuko vibe where he wants to restore his honor that his father took from him, in Jon's case, by making him a bastard. He wants to be treated like the legitimate Stark children. We see this when he talks about flashbacks and having dreams of becoming Lord of Winterfell instead of Robb. And speaking of Robb, we're moving on to bonds. These are people that he has relationships within the show that would be significant to the choices he makes as his character. For the books, this is going to be Robb and Arya Stark, Ghost, and Ygritte. And his biggest flaw is going to be his bastard status. And that's because he chooses that to be what's wrong with him. He's hyper-fixating on it and makes everything he does about his bastard status, and he can't get past it, and that creates problems for him. But other than that, and being bland, that's kind of it. Alrighty, my lovelies, here you have it. This is what the George R.R. Martin version of Jon Snow looks like, spelled out on D&D 5e sheets. Thanks for sticking around to see how he turned out. Be sure to hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell so you won't miss out on any of our content. And be sure to sign up on Patreon to help vote on who we'll cover next. That's all the time I have for today, my lovelies. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Mwah.